Hi! So in this video, I wanted to make a presentation about a military card regarding armored vehicles and its connection to the what's usually called as the Yugoslav wars or Balkan wars or Bosnian war also as well and so on. And one of the reasons I'm actually making this video is because this year it's well, let's say last year it was like 30 years since the war in ex-Yugoslavia started, and this year it's 30 years since the war in Bosnia started. And as you can see on this card, and I'm actually holding it here in my hands, I bought it once in a second-hand shop here in Stockholm. But the card itself, like the presentation, it's actually in Danish. And what can we see here now? Okay, I can understand Danish because I'm also a Swedish speaker, so I will do some shorter translations here for you. So if you look here on the kind of upper right corner, what's stated there, it's the it's Herrens Kampskole, which is like army's, how to say, like combat school, literally translated. So it's like the, how you call it, like the field army, so armed, so to say. And but it's also stated, it's here, it's a card for like recognizing armored vehicles. And this was made probably at some point, let's say in beginning of 1990s, so like 1991, 1992. And this is interesting because the Danish military personnel is a part of the it was first a UN mission called UNPROFOR, United Nations Protection Force, and later on, after the war in Bosnia, after 1995, it became, or like after the war, it became SFOR, Stabilization Force, but then the mandate was given to NATO. So what was very special with the Danish military personnel is that they even had tanks. So they were using the German-made, or even let's say West German-made Leopard 1 tanks. So you can say that the Danish personnel or contingent in the UNPROFOR was, let's say, the best equipped one, or let's say if you now speak about firepower and more heavier equipment. So that's one thing we can see here. And on the left side, you have kind of instructions for the military personnel, so how they can report about a certain armored vehicle. So for example, like how to recognize and report about a vehicle based on wheels, based on turret, cannon, and other important parts of a armored vehicle, a tank or armored fighting vehicle is similar. So these are the things we can see. And another interesting thing, in my opinion, if you look on the lower right corner, is that you can see actually two tanks that were already outdated when the war in Bosnia started, but they were still used. So you have the M4 Sherman, and then you have the T-34. Now, these were the tanks that were used during the Second World War. So these are the tanks that basically kind of, you can say metaphorically, won the Second World War for the Allied forces, because Americans and the Soviets were able to produce them in higher numbers than, for example, Nazi Germany could produce some of its own tanks. And interesting thing, like why these tanks were even used, like these kind of very old tanks at that time. Well, it's because the Yugoslav People's Army, so the Yugoslav Armed Forces, actually kind of didn't want to get rid of them, because one of the ideas of this kind of concept of total defense in ex-Yugoslavia was to even use old equipment, old tanks, old trucks, old airplanes, everything, in order to use it in a case of war. So even these like Shermans and T-34s were still in military storages. And when the war started, so these storages were opened and these tanks were mobilized and used. I would say that the T-34 was much more used than the Sherman tank because if I remember right, there was a larger number of T-34s. And it's very interesting what you can see here is part of the kind of early history of socialist Yugoslavia, because during, let's say, the 1940s, I mean, after the Second World War and 1950s, so Yugoslavia was receiving military equipment both from the Soviets and from the United States. So despite being officially a communist and a socialist state and country, Yugoslavia was, for example, never part of the Warsaw Pact, and it placed itself as a, let's say, neutral state, and it even formed its own bloc called the Non-Aligned Movement, together with, for example, India and Egypt. So this is why both American and Russian equipment were used during the wars in ex-Yugoslavia, mostly, let's say, Soviet equipment, but even here you can see the M47 medium tank, which was actually, or Patton, which was a standard tank for the American armed forces, for example, during 1950s and 1960s. So now if we actually go to the other side, so there are like two sides of the card. You can see here, for example, is you also had the M36 gun carrier, or like a tanks destroyer, and that was also a very like Second World War era vehicle, but it was still used during these wars, like in Croatia and Bosnia, and they were actually even used during the Kosovo War, so like in later 90s. And if I remember right, there was this kind of like a funny photo of kind of modern American tanks passing by a very old American tank, but at that time was still used during the war. So, and here you also have more focus on other aspects, and not only vehicles. For example, you can see the so there is, for example, D-44 and T-12. So these were actually, or they are still, anti-tank guns, Soviet-made. And if I remember right, so the Yugoslav armed forces was actually mainly using the T-12 100mm anti-tank gun. So these guns were actually mainly used, like in most cases, not against tanks, but they were more used as a kind of a field artillery. So they were used for, unfortunately, like sadly, for shelling cities, urban areas, against entrenched positions, and for similar actions. And one interesting case is that these guns are actually still used, if you have been following the current war in Ukraine since 2014. So both the Ukrainian armed forces and the separatist armed forces are actually still using them. And also there is some more additional text here. So these are like abbreviations. For example, you have the KVG stands for Kampfwagen, which basically means fighting vehicle or combat vehicle. And there is also, for example, let's say let's say Lima Victor Mike, which stands for I'm not sure how you like, Danish is a little bit pronounced differently from Swedish, but I understand the word. It's like a anti-air how we call, like, anti-air system, like missile, so to say. And there is also the AMF, so Alpha Mike Foxtrot, and that's for like amphibious. So, and you can see here actually, you can see that the card was actually made in September. It says September 1993. Actually, I didn't see that detail until now, so I kind of became a little bit surprised. And I think that it's kind of very interesting to study like the card itself, because it's a small, how to say, piece of history. But if you connect it to some larger, let's say, developments, if you connect it to other aspects, other facts, then you do get like a more deeper understanding for how things were done. You know, history is very much about understanding transactions, you know, between people and machines. So transactions and interactions, let's say like that. And just by studying this military card or like military overview, you can get some more additional insights and information. So thank you very much for listening, and please follow my channel, Vlad's History, for additional videos. Thank you.